Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the current status of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, as well as the activities taking place in the civil war in Iraq? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. You're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today, we're taking a look at the situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, as well as the conflict that's raging in the civil war in Iraq. But we're also going to talk about a very interesting book about the Air Force, the United States Air Force in particular, but it could apply to air forces all around the world. My guest today is an expert on these issues. My guest today is Dr. Robert Farley. Dr. Robert Farley teaches at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky, where he focuses on military technology, maritime affairs, and ship power. His new book is Grounded: The Case for Abolishing the United States Air Force. Dr. Robert Farley, welcome to Global Connections Television.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. I also could have mentioned, too, that you also teach military doctrine, transnational politics, as well as national security. So you've covered the waterfront to a large degree.
I do all the guns and bomb stuff for the Patterson
There
School.
you go. There you go. That's very good. They have the hardware stuff.
Right, exactly.
Very good. Well, let's start off with, why don't we tie into national security and the military doctrine your new book. And this is, let me make sure I get the right title. It's called Grounded: The Case for Abolishing the United States Air Force. And this is an interesting book. I have not had a chance to read it, but the title is very interesting. I'm just curious, what is the thrust of this book, and how do you tie it in to national security as well as into military doctrine?
Well, it's a book about air power. It came out this March from University Press of Kentucky, and we've all been very happy with it so far. The basic thesis of the book is that America needs air power. Everything we do with respect to military affairs, technology, doctrine requires the use of air power. But air power doesn't mean an air force, that there are lots of ways of organizing American air power that would potentially make more sense than organizing them in a specific medium-oriented bureaucratic organization that's going to have all of its own interests and all of its petty conflicts, its organizational dynamics, and so forth. And so the argument is to take the assets the Air Force has and go back to a situation very similar to the one we had in 1947 before the Air Force was created, when the Air Force was still part of the United States Army. Also transition some assets to the United States Navy, and then move back to a two-system model, or two-service model.
Now, we have in the United States, and this applies to a lot of countries around the world, we're talking about the U.S. as a prototype, but the majority of the countries could probably identify with a lot of what you're saying today. But you have basically the Army, the Navy, the U.S. Air Force, and you have the Marines. Now, the Army and the Navy all have air power. They have their own airplanes, is that correct?
Right. We currently have something along the line of 5 air forces, depending on how many you count. The Army has its Air Force, the Navy has its Air Force, the Marine Corps, which is the Navy's Army, has its Air Force. The Air Force has an Air Force. The Coast Guard has an Air Force. And if you want to count the CIA's Air Force, then they have an Air Force as well. So we've already sort of dispensed with the notion that air power only belongs to the Air Force. At this point, it's just what's the most optimal set of organizations we could have that would make everything make sense and allow everyone to work together productively.
Exactly. Now, what are the main arguments for basically eliminating the Air Force and putting the resources into the Army, Navy, perhaps the Marine Corps, and beefing up their particular air power arrangements? Is it that they're silos, that you have like a silo Army, a silo Navy, silo Air Force, so often they don't talk to one another, that you have these organizational fiefdoms that have been built up that want to guard their own turf, and they have really no interest in sharing the resources and that type of thing? Or are those part of the arguments?
I mean, that's pretty much the core of the argument. What we think of as a military service is essentially a great big bureaucratic lobbying organization. And that's the whole reason you create them. You create it so you can protect particular capabilities from people who want to misuse those. And so the reason we created an Air Force was because people believed that soldiers and sailors weren't going to appreciate air power sufficiently. But again, it turns out that air power is part of every way that we conceive of military action, and trying to take air power out of the other two services, and especially the most important aspects of air power, means that they don't have the organic assets that they need to carry out the missions that they need to conduct on a daily basis. And so we've seen in Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, and as far back as World War II, these problems with the borders we draw between services, creating procurement, creating warfighting, all sorts of different issues associated with drawing boundaries where boundaries shouldn't exist.
Exactly. Now, do you have an idea of how much would be saved? I'm assuming there'd be some cost efficiency, cost effectiveness if you were to distribute these resources and basically eliminate the Air Force, but still have air power in the other services. Do you have an idea of how much would be saved? Because we see that the U.S. government in particular is trying to reduce their budget deficit. They're trying to reduce the budget. We know that the Defense Department, according to the General Accounting Office in the United States, something like 20 to 25% of the whole Defense Department budget is basically wasted. They say it's inefficient and they could make efficiency savings, but do you have an idea of how much could be saved by doing this?
You know, it's really very difficult to say how much we can save in concrete terms. In the really short term, it would even increase costs because you would have a bureaucratic transition. People say, well, you'd have to buy new uniforms, but that's actually an expensive proposition, reclothing and reassigning everyone. In the medium and longer term, though, especially the procurement process would be affected, right? We wouldn't have an organization that was so committed to this notion of independent air power that it needed to buy equipment, and often, as we're seeing with the F-35 and the long-range strike bomber and so forth, exceptionally expensive equipment, rather than equipment that's more geared toward the joint fight. So for right now, for example, we have this big fight between the Army and the Air Force about the A-10 Warthog. A-10 is a very inexpensive plane, and the Air Force is trying to replace it with an incredibly expensive plane, the F-35. And these are areas where we can target for savings, right? Where we can say good enough rather than absolute best, which is a struggle for us to say when we still have an independent Air Force.
And the F-35, this has turned into quite a project, and it's really been a disaster to a large degree. It's something running like $1.5 trillion now for these planes, very super sophisticated planes. They've had production problems with them. Some people are saying that they're so high tech they may never fly, that they're that advanced and you just can't get all the parts to work together. What is the status? We won't stay on that too long, but what is the status of the F-35 and what should be the final conclusion?
Well, the F-35 remains a very troubled program, and it is, as you suggest, incredibly expensive. The per plane cost has skyrocketed beyond what we were told it was going to be. Almost every plane in history that ends up being successful has a set of problems in the teething. So if you go back to the 70s, the F-15 and the F-16 look terrible. But the F-35 has what seemed to be a really extensive set of problems. And it's complicated by the fact that not only Lockheed Martin, but also the U.S. government had taken steps to ensure that the program could not be canceled. Lockheed Martin being very smart about where it positioned factories and where it positioned assets, and the U.S. government ensuring that every other allied government in the world is also buying the F-35. So if we cancel ours, that means we've suddenly canceled the Dutch and the Danish and the British and the Japanese and the Korean Air Forces. So canceling it is an economic and diplomatic disaster, which means that no matter how bad it gets, it will still go forward. And there seems to be no way to kill the project.
When you were talking about that, it reminded me of the forewarning, the prophetic words of former President Dwight David Eisenhower, who talked about the military-industrial complex and how the United States needed to be very aware of it. And you were talking about how they work out this collusive arrangement between the government and the companies, and they put these factories in all these different states. And of course, then you get the support of the members of Congress, the U.S. senators, who do they look upon these as sort of job creation opportunities? I know they look upon them as national defense, but so often they look upon them as economic development projects, do they not, with factories and plants in their districts?
Absolutely, they do, and I think it is responsible for them to do so, right? They're looking out for the best interest of their constituents, and all of the industries that are associated with a modern fighter aircraft or a modern warship, these are good jobs, they're good wages, they're often union jobs. They are jobs that have spin-offs, all sorts of high-tech spin-offs, and so they improve an area when the defense industry moves into that area. And so the senators and congressmen are being fully responsible when they try to draw these jobs in, and they're being fully responsible when they try to keep them there. The problem is still when you get to the end result that we're still very potentially producing a product, producing an aircraft, which is not going to be cost effective for the nation as a whole.
Exactly. And that's what a lot of economists are arguing. They're saying that, true, you have economic spinoff with these jobs, no doubt about it, but when you look at the spinoff effect from the economist standpoint, you get a bigger bang for your buck or your dollar if you're doing infrastructure projects, if you're rebuilding bridges, or if you're building roads, or if you're building solar power plants or something like that. That dollar will reverberate through the economy much more than the Defense Department dollars will, even though they're important, obviously, for the people who are employed. And you're right, they are very high-paying jobs, but they do see that as the spinoff is not quite as great. Have you heard that argument?
Oh yeah, and in fact, I agree with it, that defense dollars tend to return less in terms of innovation, tend to return less in terms of economic benefit than others. But the problem is it seems so much harder to pass bridge and solar and other sorts of energy tech than it does to pass an F-35, right? Because an F-35 replaces very straightforwardly capabilities we've had in the past. And defense hawks like it, Republicans, and defense doves are, well, at least we need them, and at least we'll have jobs in my district. And so it still seems easier, and things may be changing a little bit, but it still seems easier to sell an F-35 on Capitol Hill than some series of high-tech energy project or replacement infrastructure that we absolutely need.
And of course, every country in the world wants to have a strong defense. There's no doubt about it. The first obligation of any government is to defend its people, and they want to make sure that they are prepared. But it seems as though we've had this spiraling upward. The United States, I think, contributes like 40% of the military procurements, and now that's like $1.7 trillion a year is being spent on armaments. And as we see the governments reducing their budgets, trying to cut back in different areas, this may be an ideal area to reduce, but it's going to be very difficult to do.
Right. I mean, we do see, we spend a lot less as percentage of the global economy now than we did in 1990. So that's one thing to sort of remember when we talk about defense budgets.
At the end of the Cold War.
At the end of the Cold War, we spent a lot more, and countries around the world spent a lot more. But you're right, it turns out right now that not only is our defense budget going down, but all of the European countries, almost all of them, is going down. Canada's going down. Latin America tends to be going down. Asian countries, on the other hand, are seeing an increase. And China is seeing an increase. Russia is seeing an increase. Japan is seeing an increase. We still spend in the United States more as a percent of our economy than even the Chinese do or the Russians do, although the Russian one may be changing. And of course our economy is so much larger, and so we have a much larger defense budget. But there are some trends that suggest things are kind of turning around for defense spending, and it may be on its way back up.
And of course, while we're talking, we see the different conflicts that are raging around the world, especially the ones that are really getting heated between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It looks as though we may be heading into an Intifada 3, which is a civil uprising that's not going to benefit either party. No matter what we say today, it'll be history tomorrow by the time this program airs, I'm sure. But how do you generally see what's going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians? And better yet, what can be done to bring a solution to this very intractable problem that has raged really since 1947, then when Israel came on, the UN created Israel and Palestine, and then Israel and Palestine came online in 1948. But how do you view the situation, and what can be done to improve the conditions there and stop the fighting?
That's certainly a tall order, right?
That's
a big question. Yeah, I guess my first reaction to this latest eruption is that on both the Israeli and the Palestinian side, there needs to be and understanding that there are spoilers out there, and that there are people on both sides who don't want peace, who are not interested in peace, and will do anything they can to spoil peace. And the problem is that it's been a struggle for a long time, and it's still a struggle for the governments on either side to figure out how to manage those spoilers and figure out how to push those spoilers to the side so that they aren't the ones who are ruining any opportunity that the two governments and the two peoples have to come together and come to some sort of equitable solution with respect to land and water and everything else in the region. Right? That, there are people who just don't want peace, and you have to figure out how to manage those.
Yeah, they certainly do, and certainly don't in that case. Do you see a situation where can you have a one-state solution? Some people are arguing for that now. Of course, all along, for years and years, the official policy of the United Nations, the U.S., most of the governments of the world has been for a two-state solution. The Israelis and the Palestinians living in peace side by side, making sure that each one was protected, and they didn't have to worry about an invasion and that type of thing, or mortars coming in. But is there any possibility of a one-state solution? Is that feasible, or we really have to have a two-state solution, do we not?
That's also a really big and interesting question. I'm still hopeful for a two-state solution, but to the greater extent of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and an Israeli unwillingness on the part of the political authorities, which is purely understandable from their own point of view, to ever be able to uproot a tremendous number of settlers and move them back into Israel proper. It is, I think a lot of people are coming to doubt whether the two-state solution is possible. And if it's not possible, if it just can't be done, then we have to figure out how to do a one-state solution. And that's eventually going to have to, we're going to have to settle on how we create a government that sufficiently respects civil rights, property rights, and everything else on both sides, that Israel-Palestine can be a peaceful society together. But I'm not convinced we have to go there yet. I think there is still some hope for a two-state solution.
It seems like that there are several people, obviously there are interested parties who do want this two-state solution. A lot of people believe you have to have it because if you did do a one-state solution, you would not have a, quote, Jewish state, which is what Israel wants to have, a Jewish state, and it would be almost impossible to do that if you had more Palestinians living there than you have Israelis living in the state. So it would certainly be a tremendous challenge to put that together as a one-stater, I would think, would it not?
I think that if you were to turn into if we were to pursue a one-state solution, then sort of understanding Israel as an explicitly Jewish state would become more problematic, right? The focus would be on creating a state which is a Jewish homeland in the sense that Jews can always go there and feel secure. They can always go there and believe that they will be safe. And that potentially is still possible even in context of a one-state solution. Even if we don't think of Israel as specifically a Jewish state, right? Just a state where Jews have a voice, Jews will be safe, and Jews have some sense of self-determination.
Exactly. And of course, they've been wrestling with this problem since, as I mentioned, 1948, and it's not obviously going to go away overnight. Well, another hot area of the world, it seems like there are conflicts breaking out all over the place, even though the statistics show that it's a more peaceful world, according to, it was for a while, we were trending downward as far as the number of conflicts taking place around the world. Now we see that there have been some problems in Ukraine. We see Syria is certainly a major problem. And of course, Iraq. And this situation is spinning out of control between the Sunnis and the Shiites. And of course, you have the Kurds in the north. But this was something that was predicted almost from the time prior to the U.S. invasion, the U.S.-led invasion on March 19th of 2003, when former President George W. Bush led the invasion or the U.S. took the lead on it, going into Iraq, overthrowing Saddam Hussein. And even though Saddam Hussein was certainly a vicious dictator, he was one who did not respect human rights. He was not a nice person, to put it mildly, but he was stabilizing. Right. He had stability in Iraq at that time, and he was a buffer between the Iranians and the rest of the people in that part of the world. And today we see that almost what was predicted at that time is actually taking place, that the Sunnis and Shiites do not get along, generally speaking, and of course, you can comment on that. That's a 1,400-year history between those two, but we also have a political situation there with Nouri al-Maliki, the Prime Minister of Iraq, and how he has treated the Sunnis. How do you view this whole situation as to what transpired in 2003 and where we are today?
You know, it's a classic problem where we obviously invaded in 2003. We destroyed the government that was there. And almost immediately we started attempting to rebuild state capacity. We started attempting to reconstruct the state that had been there, only with fewer teeth and with teeth aimed in the right direction. And what the last 2 years, or the last few months, I think, have really revealed is that it's a struggle to rebuild a state that has the capacity to control its own territory and has is answerable in some sense to its own people. The complaints about Maliki are well known, and most of them are, at least from the outside, correct. Although one thing I found is that Americans tend to have a very bad sense of the incentives that our clients have on their own, right? Our clients, whether you think of as far back in Vietnam as Diem, or you think of Karzai in Afghanistan, operate by intelligible logics that they understand, and they think they're doing the things that they need to survive. And Maliki thinks he's doing the things he needs to survive, and so us talking about how this is all Maliki's fault is not really true. It's our fault, right? It's our fault that we haven't been able to produce a situation where there has been an ability to reconstruct a state there. I mean, and you know, I study air power, and just from an air power perspective, it's a disaster. In 2003, Iraq had an air force. Now it doesn't, right? It's having to borrow Iran's air force and buy off-the-shelf old Soviet airplanes because we won't sell them airplanes. We haven't been able to sell them airplanes, and so you know, our ability to build this state should create just a dire warning for us in the future. Is this something we want to be in the business of? Because it's really an extremely difficult thing. It's extremely expensive, it lasts a long time, and there's no guarantee of success in the end. So, but I agree, it's a disaster right now.
Exactly. And when we look back on this, I remember when some of the proponents of the war came out back in, 2002, 2003, early 2003, Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Defense, former Vice President Dick Cheney, they were talking about how we'd be greeted as liberators. This war would only cost $50 billion. The Iraqis would pay for it. We would be there only a very short time frame, have very few people killed. Today we see it's cost us over $2 trillion. We've had 4,500 roughly Americans killed in Iraq. We've had 250,000 Iraqis that have been killed, it's been estimated. A huge number. The whole area is destabilized, and a lot of people say that it was this invasion that really was chip number one that started the destabilization of that area of the world. Now, maybe a lot of this would have happened without it, but we certainly, it seemed like, helped move it along. Would you agree with that or not?
You know, I think it's really hard to say what would have happened with the Arab Spring if we had never done Iraq, if Iraq had never been invaded. Certainly people at the time predicted that this was going to destabilize the entire region. Right now, there are still chips that we have to fall, right? I mean, the monarchy in Saudi Arabia doesn't seem plausible that it would fall right now, but then we've said the same thing about other regimes in the recent past. And we said the same thing about Syria 4 years ago, about Egypt 5 years ago. You know, I do sort of, in some sense, wish that the people who had most aggressively argued for the war in the first place now, I mean, they have freedom of speech. They are free to say whatever they want, but no one should publish what they say beyond a newsletter to their family.
I mean, you mean their credibility is not there?
Their credibility is not there. Why would we ever listen to the people who said these things in 2003 again?
Exactly. And that brings up a whole issue about the U.S. media in particular, about how they put up people, the neoconservatives, who basically were totally wrong on this war, who really jiggered the information. I mean, they put out misinformation, disinformation, and now they bring out people like Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, people like this who were absolutely, predictably wrong in 2003, and put them on TV today as though they're actually experts and we're going to take their advice. But that is certainly another story that we're going to be talking about in the future. But as we look on very briefly, have we learned anything from Iraq in the last minute or so that we have? What lessons have we learned from being involved in Iraq?
I think that we have learned that military action is extremely complicated and has extremely complicated consequences. And I think that we have learned, we can see what we've learned in Libya and Syria, where we have not intervened nearly as vigorously as we otherwise might, because we now have a better appreciation of the consequences.
Exactly, and these are very difficult issues. They're issues that are very important, and they even though they're thousands of miles away, they do impact people in the United States and in other parts of the world, and they can have an impact on trade, they can have an impact on refugees, have an impact on a variety of things, human rights and across the board, and we certainly need to learn much more about them. But Dr. Robert Farley, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.